Hi, all. I just wanted to address a fantastic question that came up toward the end of our last workshop on communication. We didn't have time to dive into it then, but I'd like to address it here. And that was on difficult feedback that may have to do with self-presentation. And specifically, we were talking about Zoom protocols, Zoom etiquette, things like body positioning, hair twirling, or hair play, posture, lighting, environment, looking sharp versus looking sloppy, and general self-presentation, right? Whether it's professional presence or executive presence. So giving feedback, right? The question came up about giving feedback on these topics can be challenging. So I'm going to address this in two videos. This first video is going to revolve around 7 tips to determine whether you even want to offer the feedback, right? What considerations are there? And then the next video will revolve around concrete tools, phrases, different strategies and approaches to actually delivering the feedback. Okay, so first, before diving into the 7 tips to determine whether you even want to offer the feedback, I want to bring awareness to the different types of difficult feedback. The first I call challenging feedback. This may simply be hard to hear, okay? Challenging feedback that's hard for the person to hear, and it may challenge their self-perception and therefore be challenging to give the feedback to them. Another kind is sensitive feedback, where somehow it feels a little delicate or perhaps even personal or brushes on the personal in nature. So it's just sensitive. Another style of difficult feedback is what I call differentiating feedback. And this is when the feedback is highlighting differences between you and the recipient potentially. And that may be because the feedback you're offering comes from a different set of values than they have, right? But any kind of feedback that highlights differences may produce tension when it's brought to light. And it may also produce relief when it's brought to light. So there's a lot of potential there. Okay, so tip number 1, with considerations for even whether you should go there, so to speak. Tip number 1 is to just be aware of and reflect on the reasons that you may hesitate in giving the feedback. Okay, so some common reasons that we hesitate are that it can be exhausting and draining to give feedback, right? It stresses us out to give this kind of feedback, especially if it's a new practice or a skill to give differentiating feedback. And again, to be specific about the feedback around self-presentation, right? The feedback could be like, hey, can you not have a huge pile of laundry in the background during Zoom meetings because it gives the impression that you're disorganized, right? That sort of brushes on calling out something personal. So you may also hesitate because the person, it's hard to hear and that they may take it poorly, get defensive, or feel hurt. Another reason we're hesitating is we may not be sure it's appropriate or in our scope to be giving this kind of feedback. Another reason is you may have simply a tendency toward avoidance, right? There may be a strategy of maintaining peace and safety by avoiding potentially contentious topics. And lastly, there may be risk aversion, and there may be a fear that the relationship will get worse if we give this kind of feedback. Okay, so tip number 2, ask yourself the question, does enough trust and rapport exist for them to be receptive to difficult feedback from me? So this is just human nature. This is, we are much more open and receptive to difficult feedback when it's coming from someone we already have trust and rapport with. When it's coming from someone where that trust and rapport and care does not necessarily exist yet or is weak, we're more likely to dismiss it or not care about it or even get triggered by it. So does enough trust and rapport exist? And if not, you may not want to offer it, right? There may be closedness to receiving it. Tip number 3 is, have you done the work of establishing a culture of being receptive and grateful for feedback on your team? So consider, do all team members understand that all feedback, any and all feedback, is a gift? Any and all feedback is an investment in relationship and in growth. Do you encourage people to ask for feedback, and do people actively practice being receptive and curious versus defensive? So not being defensive when we receive feedback is a skill. If the answer to that is no, that culture doesn't exist yet, there may be some preliminary work you want to do, some preliminary training or information you want to give to support growing that culture, sort of in training that, that value for feedback. Okay, next tip. Ask yourself, do you have radical candor skills? Okay, radical candor, let's see, I'm opening up my screen here, sharing my screen, is a phrase that was coined by Kim Scott. Here's a book, Radical Candor. And I highly suggest it for anybody who wants to dive deep into, being a great boss, great managerial practices, and a very nuanced, comprehensive view of giving feedback. Here's the model. In order to give difficult feedback in an effective way, there need to be two dimensions present. One is the willingness to challenge directly and not kind of dance around an issue. The other is to care personally, to genuinely care about a person's success and well-being. When those two dimensions are present and we're speaking from that space, radical candor will land. It will be effective, or it has the highest chance of being effective. When we're only willing to challenge directly without caring personally, we run the risk of obnoxious aggression. When we only care personally and are not willing to challenge directly, we might care too much about the person's feelings and just, at all costs avoid hurting them or making them uncomfortable. We run the risk of ruinous empathy. And lastly, the worst is if there's neither the capacity to care personally or the willingness to challenge directly, then any feedback we give will come off as manipulative insincerity. Okay, so the questions to ask yourself are, can I speak from a place of being willing to challenge directly and care personally? Okay. Next, tip number 5, ask yourself, is their presentation really getting in the way of their professional advancement? Or does it have something more to do with my personal bias, right? So there may be biases you have, there may be generational differences, just potentially like outdated notions of what is and isn't professional, right? Maybe you grew up with a notion that piercings, tattoos, certain hairstyles just can no way ever be professional, right? And so just doing a self-assessment, like, is this something really getting in the way, or is it more my stuff? Number 6, is the behavior or the self-presentation something that they have control over? Only give feedback if the answer is yes. And to be extra explicit here, I'm pretty sure this is obvious, but staying away from commenting on what may be a neurodivergent attribute or anything that can be experienced as body shaming. So for example, if somebody's posture is like this, right? I don't know if you can see me, but let's see, right? If somebody's slouching, and we're concerned that people are perceiving them as not having great professional presence, we need to make sure it's not due to something like kyphosis, right? That it's actually within the realm of possibility for them to work on posture. So I think that's naming the obvious, but just to be extra explicit and err towards naming the explicit, or naming the implicit, making the implicit explicit. Okay. Lastly, number 7, are you modeling both the behavior you want to see and the skills of receiving feedback well? Okay, so once we start kind of giving this feedback, we might, we might be getting it back, right? So what are your feedback receiving skills like? What are you modeling for the team? And, to a certain extent, we need to be the message that we want to give. We need to model it. We need to live it. And if we are asking for behaviors that we ourselves do not exhibit, then we run the risk of cynicism growing on our team, as well as a reputation of hypocrisy, right? So another approach to this is encouraging a culture of like working on it together, right? Like, hey, giving and receiving feedback is something that I'm working on too. I want us all to work on it together. Let's practice this. So that's another approach if you don't feel like you are, really solid at it yet. All right. So hope that was helpful. I would love to hear comments and thoughts and reflections in the comments below. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments below as well. And next video will be like, okay, you've decided, yes, you want to give the feedback, concrete tools to actually offer it. Thanks, everyone.